around the discussions that we've been having on sustainable finance and the taxonomy. We have today, I hope, as many people that joined us on the last webinar, something around 700 people. And what we wanted to do today was to set you through some of the key issues around what are we claiming to be significantly harmful in terms of our taxonomy thinking or no significant impact. What I wanted to also indicate as we start this webinar is to first of all welcome you, and I hope that you are in the right place, and if you're not, please do stay with us. Secondly, that you ask all your questions via the Q&A function that's at the bottom of the Zoom screen, and we will respond to as many of these questions as possible. This webinar is supposed to be planned for 2 hours, so it is now 3 p.m. Central European time. We will go until 5 p.m. Central European time. The link to the report will be posted in the chat, and as well as the link to the PDF of the slides that we have for you today. This webinar is being recorded and it will be available on the Climate Bonds Initiative YouTube channel. This should be a simple search for you on YouTube for EU Taxonomy on Sustainable Finance. So I'm hopeful that more and more of you will join us. I'm going to give just a couple more minutes for people to join, and then I'm going to start, introduce myself, introduce the panelists, and also introduce the context and importance of this particular webinar. So again, welcome. And if you would like, please do within the chat, put where you are calling in from. And as I indicated, please within the Q&A already start to put forward your questions as soon as we start. So I'm going to give just a couple more minutes to bring in more participants, knowing that in the last webinar yesterday on the social implications of the taxonomy, we had upwards of 700 people. Again, please do let us know where you're calling from, put it in the chat so that we can know who we have with us today. Great. So we've already got Leonie calling in from Berlin, Germany. It'll be nice to know who can top Germany. We've got Luxembourg. Japan, Paris, the Netherlands, Austria, Poland, Sweden, Portugal, Italy, Spain. Many from Austria. I don't know what's going on in Austria. Czech Republic. Wonderful. Great to see all of you calling in from so many different parts of Europe and the world. And I think I'm going to officially start now. So my name is Sandrine Dixon de Clèves. I have the esteemed pleasure of sitting on the EU Platform for Sustainable Finance alongside my colleagues who will be presenting for you today. I also used to sit on the technical expert group, and in particular on the taxonomy expert group, working in particularly on manufacturing. Again, the reason that we have put together these webinars is to try to ensure that we can actually exchange with as many of you as possible in terms of the important content that we are gathering. Today, we are specifically focusing, as I indicated in the opening of my introduction, we are specifically focusing on what we call significantly harmful and no significant impact within taxonomies. And let me just say that as the co-president of the Club of Rome and wearing many different hats in terms of the understanding of the planetary emergency that we are faced with today, the contextual piece for the work that we're going to present to you cannot be underestimated. The fact is that we need to shift capital as fast as possible towards green projects. We know very much, and in particular, if you looked at the most recent leaked results from the IPCC report that will come out in August, that actually we are already facing an emergency. we already are probably not going to meet our 1.5 degree target. So we have to remember that the work that we have done through the technical expert group for the taxonomy initially, and now the sustainable finance platform, is very much linked to reaching the objectives of 1.5 or better. So please keep that in mind as we move forward into understanding what we mean by significantly harmful and no significant impact with regard to economic activities. That is the work that we have been trying to unpack, understanding the tensions and trying to put in place a system that can start to give us the labels that are necessary for the investment community to truly understand where we need to shift capital in order to meet this emergency head on. So I would like to now maybe put up the slide which indicates who will be speaking to you today. I think Laetitia, you have got that slide. We're waiting for that slide. If not, here we go. Thank you. So again, we're very pleased to have an esteemed group very much working on this piece of the puzzle, which is around what is significantly harmful and what is no impact. Nancy Seitz, who is from the EIB and running much of our discussions as platform subgroup rapporteur. We have Nathan Fabian, who I will introduce to you next, who is the chair of the Sustainable Finance Platform and leading us very astutely to try to find the goals that we need and to match some of the recommendations. Paolo Maru-Loretz, who is a former Director General for Markets and Payment Systems at the Bank of Italy, and Karsten Loeffler, the Managing Director of the Green and Sustainable Finance Cluster for Germany. So I'm going to turn the floor to you, Nathan. And please continue to put in the chat where you are calling us from. We would love to know who is actually following this webinar. Nathan, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Sandrine. Hello, everyone. Welcome to this launch event for our extended environmental taxonomy report from the Platform on Sustainable Finance. Today, the information we'll present to you is the progress in our thinking on what we believe can be a very important extension to a richer taxonomy. Now, if I may say, we are seeking your input on this report and we have a consultation period to support that. And so the links will be provided for you to follow the questions and give us the feedback we need to refine our proposals for the Commission. To be clear, we're presenting a platform set of ideas to you today and proposals. This is not a Commission proposal. The Commission has confirmed in its strategy its intention to report by the end of 2021 on a potential future extended environmental taxonomy, and the platform's role is to inform that thinking by the Commission. And obviously, if the Commission intends to take any further regulatory steps, then they would follow any recommendations in December. The implication, of course, is that you're not going to see a new reporting requirement immediately to a new regulation when the taxonomy reporting obligations commence in 2022. So we're going through this discussion phase. Your feedback is really important. And on this issue of extended taxonomy, the feedback is perhaps essential because there are trade-offs here. Ever since we started work back in the high-level expert group on a taxonomy and through the TEG, there's been this question around how we should support transition of the economy. This is the key issue. When we set out our substantial contribution criteria, so the green criteria, it was clear they set the signal on where we must go, the levels of environmental performance we must reach to achieve our environmental goals and especially our climate goals. And this raised an important question and issue in the minds of many in the market. It was, if I'm not green, Does that mean my activity is unsustainable? Does it mean my activity is creating significant harm? And it was always clear to the designers of the taxonomy that this was not necessarily the case. Just because you were not identified as substantially contributing did not mean automatically that you are unsustainable or causing significant harm. But it's true that this has created a lot of concern, and we are attempting to address that today with our proposals. So we're responding with a more inclusive approach, allowing more of the economy to see itself in the taxonomy. And as you will see, more ways to describe the progress that is being made towards the achievement of performance levels that are consistent with our environmental objectives. And our hope is that this can make transition finance more widely available. Importantly, it can make transition finance more widely available without diluting the incentives to operate at a green level. The approach we're setting out today is not an alternative for scientific rigor or credibility of the criteria. Rather, it is a way for a wider expression of our criteria in the taxonomy to more of the economy. But this scientific rigor should never really be questioned, and it's certainly not in our approach. So, the architects of this work are just about to speak to you. Of course, it's a privilege to serve on the expert group and a wonderful opportunity at this time of genuine reform in financial regulation on sustainability. But the members who you're just about to hear from have been working extremely hard. They and their colleagues on the platform for 9 months, and you're going to see a very thoughtful set of ideas that have been diligently tested and presented to you. And so we hope that they provide a very sound basis to get your substantial feedback. So thank you and congratulations to Nancy and to Hugh Goldsmith, her super Sherpa, and to all the team that you're going to hear from. So Nancy, without further ado, over to you to present the work.
Okay, thank you very much. Just like to check that you can hear me well.
Very well.
Great. Okay, if at any point you cannot hear me well, please let me know and I will turn my camera off. So thank you very much for joining us today. We may refer to ourselves as SG3, and I apologize in advance if we slip into doing that. We are one of the subgroups in the platform. We are subgroup 3, and we've been working on this important concept of possibly extending the taxonomy to 2 types of activities, significantly harmful activities in terms of environmental sustainability and activities with no significant impact on environmental sustainability. But before we go into what we in SG3 have been doing, I'm going to give you a little bit of information about the platform itself, what it's doing, how we fit into the overall work of the platform. Then we're going to touch on really what's the basis of why we need an extended taxonomy, why we in the platform believe that that is needed. Nathan's given some reasons, and Sandrine has highlighted the urgency of the crisis that we're facing. So we want to really get that across. We want to show you how we're starting from the existing taxonomy framework. So this is not a whole different idea, completely separate from the green taxonomy, the taxonomy that the first delegated act, the climate delegated act was published already, of course, earlier this year. No, we're working from there and building out with our concepts from there. We then want to touch on really why we believe that this approach is so important for financing this urgent transition. We believe that there are some missing pieces of the puzzle which will help with the financing of this urgent transition to the world that we need to be in to achieve the Paris temperature goals, but also the international and European biodiversity goals, circular economy goals, depollution goals, and sustainable water and marine resource goals. So we'll try and bring the finance angle in because it's incredibly important. Access to finance and incentivizing finance for this transition is really what it's all about. Then I'm going to be handing over to one of the SG3 team who's been co-leading the work on the significantly harmful activities, who'll take you through looking at that and the transitions linked to that. Then we'll hand to another colleague who's been working as a leading the work on no significant impact activities. And then I'll come back at the end and just give you an idea of where we're going after this and what we're looking for in the public consultation. And then we'll be opening up to a Q&A to give you plenty of time to ask us about it. So without further ado, the taxonomy itself, and we've kept these things in mind. I think this is very important to say, as what we're thinking of, what we're envisaging as a taxonomy extension has this same concepts. It's about an inventory for the future. It's looking forward, understanding that the taxonomy will have to be dynamic and providing enough confidence to the market and to the public that we are targeting the right things with the finance and that there's robust definitions for that. Looking forward and taking into account that the situation will be changing year on year as we go towards the ultimate aim of a net zero, climate resilient and environmentally sustainable taxonomy and future economy. It's also an enabler for reporting, and we strongly believe that the reporting is essential. But I think it's also important to say that the risks from climate change and from environmental impacts are there whether you report or not. In fact, the difficulty is if there is not reporting, then the risks can perhaps sometimes remain hidden. But they're still there. They can still damage the economy. They can still undermine sectors. They can damage people's jobs. They can damage the environment. Those risks are there. So that's why we believe that encouraging the reporting and having clear definitions for this reporting is absolutely vital. And that is equally true, not just for green activities, but also for what we're going to talk about, significantly harmful and activities with no significant impact on the environment. Lastly, it is, and we believe this is absolutely key, it's a transition tool. This is about laying down clearly with an evidence-based, science-based approach, what is the transition that needs to happen to help people make transition plans, whether they're public or private entities, using the taxonomy so they can really use it as a tool to make their own transitions, to tell their investors and their shareholders and their stakeholders what those transition plans are, and thereby access finance for those transitions. So the taxonomy has three parts, and I think most of you know this. But again, when we have been thinking about our work, we've been looking at this and we've been saying, well, how does this apply to the type of extension we've been thinking about? And indeed, it may be slightly different between the significantly harmful and the no significant impact, as we'll come to later. But the three key parts of the taxonomy at the moment are criteria for substantially contributing to one of the 6 objectives, criteria for doing no significant harm to any of the objectives, and applying minimum safeguards. Now, it's important to keep this in mind because particularly when we talk about significantly harmful, we've been focusing rather more on the middle bubble there, on the criteria and the concept of doing no significant harm. And it is important, I think, to highlight that if you read the taxonomy regulation and you read Article 17, it actually talks about defining significant harm. You have to define significant harm if you are to avoid doing significant harm. So this is an important thing, an important aspect that we've been into from a legal standpoint, and we believe that that's a very good basis. When we talk about no significant impact, we're asking ourselves the questions, can these activities substantially contribute? How? Do we need to look at do no significant harm? When and what for? And how do we make sure that minimum safeguards are applied? But whatever we're doing when we're looking about these taxonomy extensions, we're keeping in mind the fundamentals that always went into the taxonomy. And I've been involved in the taxonomy work somewhat behind the scenes in the H-leg. If you go back that far and you look at the recommendations on the taxonomy, you'll see there was some work done on that, and I was one of the contributors. And then I was representing the EIB in the technical expert group, leading the EIB's work, along with many other colleagues in the taxonomy group. And now that we're in the platform, the same things are really important. And we are trying to keep those in mind because, as I said, we're trying to build from the current taxonomy. It doesn't help with this very fast-moving field where many entities are struggling already to try and work out how they're going to be dealing with the reporting and the requirements if we create a completely different structure. So again, everything that we've been thinking about has to be science-based. It has to build on the existing work. It has to allow for the dynamic situation, and that is equally true of the significant harm and perhaps no significant impact. It needs to be relevant and useful for all types of finance. So that's not just public and private finance, but it means it needs to be useful for issuers of bonds. It needs to be useful for equity investment in funds. It needs to be useful for lending to either public, private entities, for SMEs or large companies. It needs to be useful for all those types of financing, and it needs to be easy to use within, of course, the parameters of being set with necessary stringency on the scientific levels of performance that we're talking about. So here's the platform, and we have with us today the chair, Nathan Fabian from PRI, who was also the rapporteur of the TEG taxonomy group. So he does indeed know well what he's about. And there are supposed to be 6 groups, but only 4 at the moment are operational. The other 2 will come in later when a little bit more work has been done. And you can see they're all the same size in this picture, but in fact the TWG, the technical working group, which is working on the other 4 objectives, biodiversity and ecosystem, circular economy, depollution and water, is by far the biggest group and has a huge task to do. And they're very busy at work and will be coming to a public consultation later in July. Then there's our group, subgroup 3, which I'll come back to in a minute. Then there's subgroup 4, who are working on a possible proposal for a social taxonomy. And there was a fantastic webinar yesterday. If you haven't seen that, watch the YouTube video. And then there's subgroup 5, which is an incredibly important part of the platform's work to really look at uptake of the taxonomy, challenges in data and usability, come up with guidance, do outreach. There are a number of other webinars coming from that group. And that, I think, is vital, because when we think about our possible extensions, we also have to think very carefully about the data and usability of these possible future extensions. So subgroup 3, which is the one that I'm rapporteur of, has been looking at advising the Commission on an extension to the taxonomy for significantly harmful activities, or activities that significantly harm environmental sustainability, it's a bit of a mouthful, and activities that have no significant impact on environmental sustainability. And one of the fundamental points that we thought about right from the beginning was, what does environmental sustainability mean? If we're being asked this question and we have to produce this report advising the Commission, what does it mean? We've decided from the beginning that we are going to look at it in terms of all 6 objectives. So we pondered, whether or not there was something else we should add, but we felt in the end that these 6 objectives cover the overall overarching environmental objectives of the EU, and we should approach everything that we're looking at in terms of those 6 objectives. That also allows us to build more strongly on the current framework. And I would say that people who have suggested to us in some of our outreach meetings things like preservation of soil and other such possible objectives, we believe they fall under one of the others, such as in that case, biodiversity and ecosystems. We have to produce this report, and then having produced this report for the Commission under Article 26 of the taxonomy regulation has to produce its own report, which of course we hope will be informed by our report, before the end of this year. And that is a requirement. And that's been reiterated in the just announced renewed sustainable finance strategy. The Commission have confirmed that they will be fulfilling that task in the taxonomy regulation. I should say that the platform is made up of a wide variety of people covering all of Europe with a good gender balance, with people representing entities that are public and private, research organizations, many different contributors from corporates to banks to EU institutions to universities. It's a very broad group, all of whom are working on sustainability and are working together on this. And although subgroup 3 is actually quite a small group, it also covers all these different types of entities in the group. So we have, although small, a very balanced range of inputs. And to make sure that we gathered further input, we have done public webinars in the past. You may have joined some of them. And we've also done outreach meetings with different entities, such as corporates, banks, civil society, and so on. Now, those were Chatham House, so that everybody could speak freely. But there's quite a good summary of the outreach that we've done and the inputs that we got, obviously not attributing them to any particular speaker, but in our report. So if you're interested to see the outreach we've done, have a look. There is a whole annex actually in our report talking about the outreach we've done on this topic. But here we are now looking at what we are currently recommending. These are interim recommendations. I think I must highlight that. The reason we're going to public consultation is there's a lot of really big issues that we're still working on, and we really want to gather your input. So we've designed questions in the public consultation, not just to pat us on the back and say, well, great report, but to really dig into some of the topics that we in SG3 really want to continue working on. So we really encourage you, having attended today, to read the report, and then please do give written input on the public consultation. I'm going to go back a bit to the taxonomy as it currently stands, and that's it looks like a spider. We've got kind of nicknames for each of the pictures. This is the spider diagram. It's the spider diagram of the taxonomy, and the 3 green dots are what are green activities in the taxonomy. So number 1 is the activities that substantially contribute. Number 2 is a special kind of activity that is making a substantial contribution, which is transitional activities, and it only exists at the moment for climate change mitigation. So these are not low carbon activities, but the best in class types of activities in areas where there isn't a low carbon option yet. Then there are enabling activities, that's number 3, and they can be either other entities which are enabling somebody else to be green, for example, manufacturers of wind turbine blades or manufacturers of triple glazing. And then another type of enabling activity, which is a sort of measures activity where somebody is actually implementing a measure. So, for example, installing triple glazed windows into a building is covered under sort of building renovation as a measure. So those are the things that I think everybody thinks of. But there is another article in the taxonomy regulation that perhaps is not so obvious to everybody who's focusing on the green end of things. And that is Article 19.3. And it specifically excludes 2 types of activities from the taxonomy. Well, 1 type, but there are 2 resulting activities. Solid fossil fuel power generation is excluded in Article 19.3 from the taxonomy regulation. So with there, you could probably think of coal and peat in terms of solid fossil fuel. Now, that's something that we started from as well. We said, okay, well, this is an important thing. You have to understand and question, why was that put in? Well, why was it put in? It was put in by the legislators who understood that those activities are harmful to the climate goals. And I think there's pretty clear agreement on that. When we talk about net zero or climate neutrality and a 1.5 degrees temperature goal, I think it's clear that those 2 activities that have been mentioned are not foreseen to continue into that low carbon world. And I'll come back to why not, or rather I'm going to ask Paolo to come back to why not. So when we started looking at the extensions of these 2 types of activities that we've been asked to look at, we said, well, let's say that those 2 activities, peat and coal-fired power generation, are significantly harmful. What else is significantly harmful? And we have come up with some recommendations, which you can see they're very, very simply summarized. They're actually, the interim recommendations are all laid out in more detail in the report, of identifying other activities that are what you might call always significantly harmful. Now, we actually have a better title, a more precise title, but unfortunately it doesn't fit on the slide. So I'm afraid, and Paolo will be very cross with me, I'm still calling it always significantly harmful. But what we're actually calling it is activities with no technical possibility to transition away from significant harm. We're also saying, okay, as well as that, which is a really important thing, we have said we're going to use the do no significant harm criteria as a criteria for significant harm. And as I said, we've discussed the legal side of this. That is what Article 17 says, and we are clear in our discussions with the lawyers that we can use do no significant harm as a threshold for significant harm. And this is subject, of course, to doing an assessment of these criteria, not to check whether they are stringent enough, but to check on whether they're appropriate for use and how they're being used in the market. And yes, again, Paolo will give you more information on that, on some overall look at transitions, which we believe are really valuable and different from green transitions, but that we believe finance should be available. And this really brings me back to the fundamental point that labeling something and doing nothing about it is not the point. What we really need to do is transition away from those activities, or transition those activities away from the situation that they're doing significant harm. And that is what it's all about. Driving the transition, and in the taxonomy, driving finance for that transition. So we're actually recommending that extension to significantly harmful. But as you can see in the middle, we're also recommending an extension to no significant impact, but with a priority to the significantly harmful. And under no significant impact, we've got a couple of points that we want to emphasize, which we'll come back to. And we are looking at different ways of doing it. We believe you need a level 1 change in the taxonomy regulation, but we also think that we probably need to do further usability assessments. There are some questions around that, and Carsten will be giving us more information on that. So now to go to what we call our 4 boxes diagram. As I said, unfortunately, we've slipped into giving them all nicknames. This is 4 boxes. Really, really important to start with the taxonomy itself. The taxonomy itself is box 2. And what we've identified is that if you take an activity and one objective, regardless of the fact that you might find these criteria in different annexes of the Climate Delegated Act at the moment, you have a technical screening criteria for substantial contribution, which you might think of as green. You also have a criteria for do no significant harm. And what we're saying is that is a criteria for significant harm. So if you're worse than that, if you're higher than that, if you're having a bigger negative impact than that, then you're doing significant harm. In other words, that activity is significantly harmful to that objective. That leaves a space in the middle. And we've had many meetings with people who say, well, we don't think it exists. You know, there isn't such a space. We believe there is such a space. And I'll give you one example of where it clearly exists. If you look at the energy, power generation, electricity generation sector, you have a technical screening criteria for substantial contribution, which is 100 grams of CO2, carbon dioxide equivalent, per kilowatt hour. But you also have a do no significant harm to mitigation criteria, which is 270 grams of carbon dioxide equivalent per kilowatt hour. So you have a gap in between 100 and 270. What is that space? Now, we hear a lot of discussion about this space, and we feel that there's a risk of it being given inappropriate names. We don't believe, for example, that it is light green. We don't believe that it's all harmful. We believe that it's a range of performance that goes from almost substantially contributing to almost significantly harmful, and everything in between. Now, we've decided that it's important to give that a name so that we can label it and talk about it. And we've decided to call it intermediate performance because we feel that's quite a neutral sort of term. It's kind of in the middle. We used to, in fact, call it the middle space, but we're now calling it intermediate performance. And what that gives you, and here I come back to to the importance of language, which allows you to discuss these concepts. And I appreciate, which one of our colleagues pointed out the other day, that this box is the wrong way up for what I'm about to say next. And thanks to Jorg from Allianz for spotting that. We're going to have to turn this diagram the other way up, because what it gives you is traffic lights for sustainable finance. And we don't believe that we should discuss a brown taxonomy. We believe that that's an inappropriate term. It's also a confusing term. But we believe that colors do help people discuss. And we've discovered by doing a bit of research that traffic lights are always these colors all around the world. And red always means stop, and green always means go. And the space in the middle is, in some countries, called amber or orange, sometimes gold. We believe that this is understood by pretty much everybody that lives anywhere or near a road and is old enough to ride a bicycle. So this is what we're calling it, traffic lights for sustainable finance. And it then gives us the ability to discuss transition from one place to another. And on that note, I am going to now hand, oh no, sorry, I'm not going to hand over. I'm going to go to my next slide. I'm sorry, I've got a super sort of setup where I can't see the next slide. I'm being overtaken by my own technology. What this allows us to do is to look at the whole economy and say, okay, how does this help in improving this binary misinterpretation that everything that's not green is somehow harmful? Well, what it does is it gives you labels, it gives you descriptions, it gives you the ability to talk about transition outside the green. And if you look across on the left-hand side, you can see what we have at the moment is taxonomy activities and then a lot of empty space. We don't know what it is. Is it harmful? Is it not? Is it got no significant impact? Is it actually beneficial? Nobody knows, because it's not reported, it's not labeled. Whereas if you look at the right-hand side, if you are to actually start trying to look at labeling some of these other types of activities, you get a much clearer idea of what's going on in the rest of the economy. And if you look at the lower diagram, you can see on the left-hand side, there you have, let's say, a portfolio, or let's say a fund, or let's say a lending portfolio of a bank or a bond. And you can see you have green activities and then you have other activities. You don't know what they are. Whereas in the extended taxonomy, with the colors and the labeling of significantly harmful and the intermediate space, you get a clearer idea of what else is in those boxes. And I'm just going to go back to here, because what we're talking about is not just labeling the taxonomy activities, but we're also saying in box 3, here are activities that will come into the taxonomy. They will have the same criteria. They will come in. They're not there in the future, but they're coming. So we must bear that in mind. And we're also saying, look, there may be other activities like Article 19.3. We need to look at those and identify them as these activities that don't have a possibility, technically, to transition out of that significantly harmful space. That's box 1. So they're just sitting there by themselves, and we believe there's something very important that can be done there. But also on the right-hand side, you can see box 4. You could think of it as just being what's left over after quite a lot of work has gone by and box 3 activities have gone into the taxonomy. Or you could proactively look at that box. And depending on how you approach these different extensions, that gives you much more information on this bottom right diagram as to what is in the rest of the portfolio that isn't green. It gives investors a much clearer idea of what is the content of a fund. And it gives shareholders of a bank a much clearer idea of what is in the loan portfolio of the bank. And indeed, if someone wants to issue a bond, and only some of it is green, so they wouldn't be perhaps telling everybody what's in the rest of it, but this would give some further information. And in fact, we believe that this is incredibly important, this kind of level of clarity and a wider set of definitions also allows for not only transparency, but more discussions on valid transitions. So I'm going to very quickly take you through something that I think is fundamental to understanding the dynamic nature of the taxonomy, and this is critically important. So the taxonomy is dynamic. It is dynamic by its nature because we have to move towards the end goals. But the paths that we take to get there are incredibly important as well. And this graphic gives you an image of what might be happening in a high impact sector, perhaps for an objective like climate change mitigation. So you can interpret this as perhaps carbon dioxide, and emissions have to drop to the net zero world by 2050. Now, of course, some sectors, like in the global report by the International Energy Agency, they indicated this for electricity generation, has to fall to net zero by 2040. So this is a very generic diagram. You don't sort of interpret it as being for any particular sector, but what it shows is the curves of substantial contribution criteria and do no significant harm criteria will need to fall over time down to this net zero. And this sort of dark green band you can see along the bottom labeled Z, this is the low carbon solution. So at some point in this sector, if in fact a low carbon solution becomes available, the substantial contribution curve will probably drop down. For example, if it becomes available, it might drop down to where Z dash is, and the do no significant harm curve will also drop. But however the curves are shaped, you have this green area, the green taxonomy, you have a performance level which is failing, if you like, or worse than the do no significant harm criteria, which is the red area. And then you have the middle traffic light, the amber area, which is between the two. And this brings us some very important points that it's worth looking at. One is that what is the entity who is doing the activity, which is currently at the point W in the red space? What is that entity doing about that? Now, you could have an entity who, I'm sorry to say, might not care, might not be making a plan, doesn't realize they're doing significant harm to the environmental objective of climate change mitigation and the Paris goals. But you have many entities who are indeed aware and wish to transition to a different performance level. Now, they may be able to make a transition to green level of performance, and I'm sure that if they can, that will be incentivized by the current taxonomy. But they may not be able to. That may take too big an investment, or the technology may not be available to get there quite yet. And we believe that they might be able to move into the middle space. And we think that that's really important. But taking account, as I said, of the dynamic nature of the taxonomy and the fact that our goals, are set in the future and we have to get to them, if that entity continues to do that activity at the same performance level for some period of time, they will eventually find themselves drifting back into the significant harm space. That's really important. So one of the other things we're thinking about is this forward-looking aspect. How can you have better predictability as well as clarity on what are these pathways, so that entities, corporates and public entities as well, would be able to make good plans by knowing what these pathways are. And I think that the Fit for 55 package that's coming out tomorrow will help us a lot with that, because of course we're now looking at the EU's very important 2030 goals of reducing carbon dioxide greenhouse gas emissions by 55%. So that gives you an idea about one way of looking at the dynamic nature of the taxonomy. But as you can see here, we've said that other environmental objectives may not look like that. And this is something I'm calling Neapolitan ice cream, although since the football result, I may need to rethink that. It is a diagram for an objective that doesn't have a falling curve. Now, this one is drawn for adaptation. It could be that, for example, biodiversity might have a different sort of diagram, and maybe a diagram which looks at the good water status, the good environmental status of water bodies might have a different diagram. This one is for adaptation, and it's drawn with the process in mind. So I'm well aware, and I'm sure many of you are, that of course climate change impacts and the risk of physical climate change is going to increase over time. But this is a diagram about the process-based technical screening criteria, and it basically splits the sort of world into three sort of performance levels: not doing anything about climate change impacts, not assessing the climate vulnerabilities and not taking action, and then the substantial contribution criteria, which is to assess the climate vulnerabilities, to address all material risks and to continue to monitor and address them, And then there's a middle space, an intermediate space, which in fact is where the activity has looked at climate vulnerability, has addressed material risks, but it's not doing any ongoing monitoring or looking at where it needs to adjust. So again, that is a very important transition to get out of that significantly harmful space. Incredibly important, because so many sectors are vulnerable to climate change impacts. But if they just stay still in that state, in some point in the future, as climate change impacts are increasing, or maybe as their operations change and the organization changes, they may not be addressing all their material risks because they haven't got a monitoring system in place. And so they might slowly drift back towards being more vulnerable to climate change. So we just think that this is useful to have in mind that falling curves is a great diagram, but some of the other objectives may not quite look like that, but we still believe that this dynamic aspect is incredibly important. So now I'm going to hand over to Paulo Murillo Reitz. I hope I'm pronouncing it right, Paulo, who's going to talk to you about the work we've been doing on significantly harmful activities.
Thank you, Nancy. Yes, I think Nancy already gave the overall picture of our work. Coming back to these 4 boxes graph, the box number 2 represents the situation in which economic activities find themselves at the current stage for looking at those activities which are covered by the EU taxonomy at the moment, meaning with this that they are within the scope of the delegated acts that have been already issued regarding the first 2 objectives of the EU taxonomy. So any activity can be considered as providing a substantial contribution to sustainability, or if they do not comply with the SH thresholds, the SH technical screening criteria, we have to assume that they are causing a significant harm to the environmental objectives. In fact, as you know, the Article 17 of the EU taxonomy defines significant harm to environmental objectives. The article from 10 to 15 require the European Commission to issue delegated acts that establish for each environmental objective technical screening criteria for determining whether an economic activity causes significant harm to one or more of the environmental objectives. And this is a very important point because having received confirmation from the Commission, the platform, or the SG3, considers that failing the NSH criteria is technically equivalent to causing significant harm. This is a very important point because this implies that the current taxonomy already includes the building blocks of an SH extension. That is, it includes the criteria according to which SH significantly harmful activities should be defined. So looking at box 2, we consider that the red space is a space where significant harm is made to the environmental objective. But as Nancy has already mentioned, there are also activities which are excluded from the taxonomy. As for the moment, there is only one, fossil fuel power generation. But we consider that these activities are representing the whole set of activities for which no technical solution is available that allows an improvement in the environmental performance. As a consequence, we consider that further such activities can be identified with respect to the whole set, all the 6 environmental objectives that have been established by the EU taxonomy. So if this is true, we have to assume that the whole set of SH performance activities are made of two components. The first one are activities for which no technical solution to improve are available. And the second component is made by activities for which such technical solution exist. And the level of harm they bring to the economy can be similar. There can be no difference in practice or in principle with respect to the two components. But what is really different for them is the future perspectives. While the SH, the significantly harmful activities that are not in a condition to improve their environmental performance can only be dismissed. The activities for which the technical solution exists can either be dismissed, of course, but can also undergo an investment plan allowing the activity to leave the harmful state in which they are implemented at the moment and transition towards a better environmental performance. As far as the dismissal, there is a suggestion that is made in this document, that is to establish some technical screening criteria which allow to consider sustainable all the activities supporting the dismissal of harmful activities. From the second point of view, the transition, as Nancy already mentioned, the recommendation the platform provides is to favor. The recommendation is that the NSH taxonomy should be introduced to the extent that it allows to support the transition out of the SH space. Nancy said labeling an activity as harmful is not what we really, it's not our purpose. Our purpose is to allow those activities to move out of the SH space in order to go hopefully towards the substantial contribution area, or as an alternative to the intermediate performance level. So if you look at the first recommendation 3, 4, and so on, and 5, you will find the way in which the platform recommends that these 3 levels should be treated. As I just mentioned, the idea is that the purpose of the extended SH taxonomy is to allow activities to improve their environmental performance. So we can look at the 3 environmental performance levels, looking at the way in which the dynamic, it is a different dynamic from what Nancy was arguing before, but it's a dynamic. We have activities falling in the red space, and we know that according to the current taxonomy, all the movements away from anywhere leading to substantial contribution are considered green movements, green transition plans. They are treated as far as the disclosure is concerned, and so on. What is not recognized at the moment is because we don't have the red space defined, but if we define the red space, we will have movements out of the SH space towards a better environmental performance. We suggest that the movement from SH to the intermediate space should be labeled as intermediate transition, and that in a way should be recognized by the taxonomy, or according under a different option. We will talk about the options that are considered in order to allow the economy to improve its overall environmental footprint. If we want to recognize such movements, this is provided that there are some requirements that they are made according to some requirements, which regards, first of all, the effectiveness of the plan. That is the fact that the plan is achieving at least an intermediate performance and is aimed at remaining in a stable way in the intermediate performance level due to the dynamic nature of the taxonomy. In this case, the dynamic nature Nancy was explaining before. So the idea is that if you go to the intermediate space, you must have a plan to continue to improve, or at least a plan which allows you not to fall back into the significant harm space in a short-term period. So we are looking at the effectiveness of the plan and to the credibility of the plan. So to the governance of the plan, who has to validate the plan, whether the plan has been audited and so on. But these are issues on which the platform and SG3 are still working, and we count on your suggestions for improving our thinking about this. There might be a third movement within this space, that is the white arrow. It is white because we don't have any specific recommendation to give, because we have to think about, once again, we count on you. This is the movements which achieve an improvement in the environmental performance, but the economic activity still remained in the intermediate space. So the improvement is significant, but not in line with what would be required by a taxonomy approach. I think that I can stop here, and then in case come back whether there are any questions.
Okay, thanks very much. And just one other thing I thought I'd mention before handing over to Carsten is, you see the red arrow. And the red arrow is just to highlight that we are saying in our report that if an improvement is made, but that the activity is still performing at a level where it is in the red space, in the significantly harmful space, then this needs to be understood. This is not a useful transition in terms of environmental sustainability, as it is still causing significant harm. So now,
Nancy, may I interrupt you for one moment? Yeah, I think there are lots of questions to ask as to try to reduce the use of acronyms and also better explain what we're meaning between significant harm and no significant harm. So we need to be very careful as we go through the description here to remind ourselves that there might be some people who have not been as close to this work as we are. Two key suggestions. One is we need to have the presentations put up in the chat before people actually go, because many of them are asking for the presentation. Two, we also need to make sure that if we have a list of acronyms, that we also put them in the chat in previous reports. So just a request that I'm seeing coming up quite a bit in the chat. Carsten.
Okay, that's fine. I don't actually know, I'm sorry, how to put the slides into the chat. Is that something I can just paste them, or maybe
you resolve this with John and Climate Bonds offline as we let Carsten take over the floor.
Yes.
Thank you.
So Carsten, over to you to talk about no significant impact. Thank you.
Yeah, many thanks, Nancy. Many thanks, Sandrine, for introducing this session. Good afternoon to everyone. Good morning, good evening, wherever you are. I will talk about the non-significant impact, in brief, NSI space. This is actually about non-significant environmental impact, just to be clear. I will talk about what it is about. I will talk about pros and cons, also related to the potential size of the segment. That will be followed by a few thoughts about particular more in-depth points that we've been discussing in the platform on sustainable finance. And finally, I will try to get to a small summary remark. To start with, what is non-significant impact economic activities about? Having this box 4 in front of you, in front of us all, actually it means those economic activities that haven't been covered by the existing taxonomy, neither with respect to substantial contribution nor with significant harm, and that are not likely to be covered by the taxonomy going forward. In that sense, it's a kind of a residual of activities that are very likely never to be covered by those criteria. Again, substantial, and I emphasize substantial contribution, just not any contribution, and significant harm, and again, to emphasize significant harm. There's question marks, those speak to specific points that I will come back to a little later. There's one question that relates to those economic activities that are maybe non-significant impact or of low impact, if you want, to the environmental objectives that are already part of the existing climate taxonomy, climate-related taxonomy, in particular those economic activities that have been included by the European Commission in the Annex 2 of the Delegated Act, the recent Delegated Act on climate adaptation. In particular, those activities that sit in the service sector that can contribute substantially to climate adaptation, in particular when they put forward a climate resilience plan. And in that sense, we thought very much about, okay, how to deal with those activities. And there's further aspects that will come back toward the end of my remark, that those economic activities that just by having a substantial contribution to adaptation, by introducing a resilience plan, still can be in the primary activity apart from the resilience plan, be no significant impact. That's what the thinking by the platform is on what comprises the no significant impact space. That is box 4 on the slide. When it comes to the pros and cons, we looked at that very diligently, looking at both sides of the coin. Having thought about, okay, what might be very beneficial, what might impede the usefulness of a non-significant impact extension of the taxonomy. So let me start with the pro arguments. First, it's about providing comfort, meaning that in particular, safeguarding access to finance for those activities that are not part of the green space, the substantial contribution space, would be, say, the non-significant impact activities could be identified much better than just now, because they would fall into the other space that is not covered yet by the taxonomy. With the risk of increased financing costs, because there might be confusion and they might be classified as more harmful impact than would be necessary. So it's about getting clarity on investment opportunities from a financial sector perspective as well. Maybe we'll come back to that later with some additional minimum environmental criteria on top, but we'll talk to that a little later in more depth. Basically, it's then kind of doing the step from an uncharted territory to a known territory. And that means, in effect, that, again, from a financial sector perspective, there's likely lower transition cost, in particular when assessing those economic activities. Meaning there's a quick and cost-effective assessment possible with a positive list of non-significant impact economic activities. And it safeguards, in particular, smaller actors in the financial sector and beyond to assess actually those economic activities. So it makes it more easy for them to actually get their head around what non-significant impact activities actually are. And that in turn will contribute to comparability and understanding across the market. There's one other pro argument, and that is about providing nuance. I already touched on that a little bit, but by having a non-significant impact economic taxonomy, there's more nuance in classifying economic activities in the green space, maybe in the yellow space, and the red space, and in the remaining, the residual space, by having a positive list of those economic activities. So that would provide additional information to investors, and not only to investors, it might be useful for supervisory authorities because they will have a much better understanding about that bracket of economic activities with respect to attached transition-related risks, actually likely lower transition risk than with other economic activities. So they, supervisory authorities might benefit. With respect to reasons why a non-significant impact extension might not be a good idea, there's still question marks around the actual size of the non-significant impact activities list. It's kind of a corresponding tubes concept that we can think of in this respect, because what is covered positively or maybe in future negatively by a substantial contribution / a significant harm taxonomy would no longer be available to a non-significant impact extension of the taxonomy. Looking at sizes of the non-significant impact space, it's interesting to see that just by a back of the envelope analysis, our assumption was in the working group that roughly 25% of value added and 35% of enterprises in the European Union would potentially fall under that bracket. Of course, there's a caveat to be mentioned that it depends in the end of the definition of what actually contributes substantially or provides or risks significant harm to the environmental objectives. By the way, in those more likely services sector, the share of SMEs and micro enterprises tends to be in the 90+% area. So what we will be faced with is that there's quite a significant number in the millions of small-sized enterprises. There's as well the question about, okay, when we look at extending the taxonomy, what should be prioritization? Should non-significant impact be higher or lower prioritized? And there's some arguments that talk about that transition activities might have more impact, so those should be prioritized. Hence, non-significant impact should be deprioritized. There's again the argument that the financial sector stakeholders can very well do their own analysis in terms of what would fall into this residual space. So in that respect, such an extension of the taxonomy would not be required. And actually, what is maybe a very big concern, and I've seen this in the question and answers box as well, is, okay, what amount of complexity we would add to the overall concept. And complexity is certainly a big issue. It depends on further analysis in terms of what economic activities could be included under the non-significant impact bracket. And if that can be made pretty straightforward, easy to use, then the complexity issue might not be such a big issue. And there's another
Kirsten,
point
can I
that
ask you to finish up, because we've got lots.
Yeah, we'll do so. Then I will just relate to just a few key points that are material in the further discussion, and that is actually there's questions, and this is a question to the audience as well, as to what extent environmental safeguards should be added to a non-significant impact taxonomy. That's one. Second, what should be the level of introduction into the overall system, i.e. changing the taxonomy regulation on level 1, or would a guideline on level 3 suffice for the beginning, or maybe just a third option looking at, and that is in the report, and you can look it up via the climate adaptation route. Certainly, there's thinking to be done on very small business, a light touch approach on those in particular. And then coming back to prioritization, so we have 3 options on the table, and this is what I conclude with. It's basically still not yet decided, and that is clearly outlined in the report. So we see quite some value in having a low impact, non-significant impact taxonomy. There's certainly decisions to be made in terms of prioritization. Just do it now, maybe later, when a significant harm and more complete substantial contribution taxonomy will be available, or just leave it and we will do better without. With that, I would like to hand back to you, Sandrine, and yeah, thanks for the attention.
Thank you very much, Nancy, Paolo, and Karsten, and of course, Nathan in the very beginning. I think we've got many questions that we need to get through, and I'm really hoping that we can answer some of your questions, and I think we can. I think the key here, what I'm seeing is there still is a real need to describe what we mean by do no significant harm versus green and brown. So I'm going to put that out there to you, Nancy, as to what our thinking has been. Also, the overarching workload for companies in order to report on the taxonomy. This is coming up as an issue. We've tried to simplify, but can we please have just a word on usability as well? The other key issues that I'm seeing, and I'm first putting things together and then I'll get to some of the specifics, is how do we really ensure that we look at the mixing between these specific pieces and project financing? So how does this work in practice? And this is also for small and medium-sized enterprises. If we do include some of them, it also is with regard to those companies that may not be mentioned or economic activities that may not be included. What does that mean? Are they then seen as brown, or are they seen as necessarily bad because they're not necessarily in a particular list? So we still have that confusion that's out there. Then there is some particular issues around clearly having access to this information. So I think we'll need to get to that. But let me start with those initial questions. There are many more. I'm going to come to them. Don't worry, people. But let's start with those kind of initial groundbreaking questions that set the tone as to what we're trying to do. Nancy, do you want to maybe start, and also Nathan?
Okay, so I'll just start with some of this. I think the issue about the complexity is very much in our minds. But what we have also learned from discussions that we've held is that some people in the markets are already starting to use do no significant harm to inform some of the due diligence discussions they're having with companies they're investing in. And because of that, we do think it's important to take stock of how the do no significant harm criteria are being used. And that's what we've also suggested. So although we believe that this needs to be addressed quite quickly, we do say that we think there should be an assessment of the criteria and how they're being used. We think there's a worse risk of not clarifying these things. And in fact, I was interested to hear from some corporates that they felt clarity on this point of the significant harm would be helpful, because then you're not subject to lots of people's different opinions. You can be really clear where your activities are causing significant harm and make clear transition plans to move away from that, for which you should be able to access finance. So, however, obviously, it has to be done in a way that just doesn't overload the system completely. So we do need to look at how it can be used. Yeah.
I'm going to interrupt you for 1 minute. There's also a question here about seeing the difference between harm and impact. So as you're moving forward, can you please specify the difference between harm and impact? And also, when we speak about transitional activities, do we mean specifically transitioning to more sustainable activities? So I'm pushing some clarity out to you.
Okay, so transitional activities are defined in the taxonomy regulation already, and they are green activities. So they are activities that make a substantial contribution. They are just not yet low carbon. And transitional activities actually only exist for climate change mitigation, in the words of the taxonomy regulation. But transition generally, environmental transition, and how we transition to a climate neutral world, how we transition to a climate resilient world, to a environmentally sustainable world, and how each activity does that, that is a sort of general word, transition, that's used to mean movement. So we are using it in that sense. We're saying, okay, there is green transition, but there might be examples, and we've put 2 examples in our report, actually, one about steel manufacture and one about electricity generation from gas, where we show some examples of what could be done to those activities that might be currently operating at a level of significant harm, meaning at a worse level than the do no significant harm criteria, and how they might actually make this transition to the intermediate space. Now, we're calling that an intermediate transition in our interim recommendations, but it's true, there is confusion between transition and transitional, and I don't know that I can fix that, because transitional activities are specified very clearly in the taxonomy regulation. I don't know whether Nathan wants to come in on that perhaps. On project financing, I think we're trying to address all different types of financing, and we see project financing, I mean, is one type. Indeed, you might be doing project financing of a whole activity, or you might be doing it of an improvement. But we're trying to look at, yes, sort of bond issuance, equity, lending and debt. I mean, we're trying to think about that, but it's important to remember that the taxonomy is for activities. So we try and stay focused on the activity while always considering what is the finance for that and what is the entity doing the activity. On impact and significant harm, I mean, I think impact comes in the technical screening criteria. They are usually set at a certain level of negative impact or positive impact. And then the question is, what is the activity's level of environmental performance? Is it above or below that criteria, technical screening criteria, which has set a particular level of environmental impact.
Maybe I can jump in.
Yeah.
Maybe I'll just jump in.
Sorry, apologies. I just wanted,
No.
as we're talking about also transitioning and impacts, someone has asked, how long is the so-called transitional period? So please keep that in mind when you're also answering, and I'll throw some other questions at you as you keep going.
Great, thanks, Sandrine. So the transitional activities in the Delegated Act are a very specific thing, as Nancy said. And what we're trying to do is demonstrate that other types of transitions are possible. So the underlying idea is different. And so we recognize that it's perhaps unhelpfully got the same word in there, but common use of transition in the market means that we need to try and respond to that frame of reference. We can work out the terminology as we go. Your feedback on that is important and welcome, but we're really just trying to distinguish the ideas. And I think that's what we should focus on. And so one type of activity generally is the best available technology, the best available performance in a sector, even if it's not low carbon. That's what transitional activity means in the Delegated Act, in the taxonomy regulation rather. And we're trying to introduce this intermediate idea. And the W line on that slide you can see represents it. And clearly that's going to a performance level, which is not going into the green. Transitional activities go into the green. So bear with us while we work out the language, but the ideas are definitely different. On the question of timing of how long is transition, well, we're actually not specifying, in most cases, we don't specify timing for criteria changes. What this falling curves diagram represents is that as there are reviews of criteria over time, and these are part of the implementation of the regulation, it's likely that the curves will fall, that the requirements will get tighter. And so if I am that W line, and you can see I'm making an investment, an intermediate transition to get into the amber space, then I'm in that transition space in the middle, if you like. I'm amber colored somewhere up until around 2035 or just before. But unless I keep investing to keep improving my performance, then I'm dropping back into the significant harm space. And this is where there is a timeline in practice because of the review cycle of the criteria and them getting tighter as we go. So that is how hopefully the answer to the how long question. And over time, every 3 years, the criteria would be reviewed. They may not change every 3 years, but they should be tightened as we go. So back in your hands, Sandrine.
Yeah, and I thank you for also getting into the amber space, because there's a lot of recognition that we're giving a much clearer explanation now of the traffic light. And there is some question as to how this is going to work when we apply it to other dimensions of the taxonomy. So the social and the more environmental indicators of the taxonomy. So this is one question, and does the traffic light really work? The other is the definition of amber activities. How does that differ from eligible activities? As an activity can only be amber if it is eligible to the EU taxonomy activities. So would this be automatically considered as amber or not? So that's, could someone answer that? I don't know, Nathan, if you can. So this is going much more into the different colors, the traffic light and the amber.
I certainly can. Why don't we let Nancy come in first, or the team, and I can add if needs be. I think they've been thinking about these questions in some detail.
Who would like to answer that question?
So I'm going to go for that. I've gone back to the 4 boxes. Can you see the 4 boxes, Sandrine?
Yes, I think so.
Okay, so activities that are in box 2, the taxonomy, are included, which is sometimes called eligible activities. I think in the Article 8DA it's called eligible. They're activities that are covered by the current delegated acts of the taxonomy. And of course, that is not the whole economy. So we already have box 3, which is, if you like, activities that will become taxonomy eligible. They will become included, but they're not yet. So once an activity is in the taxonomy with criteria set, then you have this intermediate performance is there, if you like, because you have the criteria and you have a performance level that's defined as, you know, better than the substantial contribution criteria or worse than the do no significant harm. And if those are metrics or things that you can clearly distinguish, you have an area in between. But it's true that for activities that are not included yet, so box 3, we can anticipate that there will be a green, an amber, and a red, but we don't know what they will exactly be because nobody has set those criteria yet. You can almost think of that as being the work plan of the, as I mentioned, the big group in the platform, the technical working group. They are the activities that will come in to the taxonomy through subsequent delegated acts. And so there is potential green, amber, and red levels of performance for those activities. So indeed, I do think one of the things that we're thinking about is whether further clarity to the market on what activities are coming up, what is going to be coming into the taxonomy, might be useful so that indeed entities are aware of it. And what Carsten was talking about was trying to clarify what's not going to go into the taxonomy. So instead of seeing as box 4 as kind of left over, you actually set about defining these low impact activities in order to say, you know, these are different, they are really low impact. But indeed, you can have amber foreseen, intermediate performance foreseen in activities that are not yet in there. It's just that you wouldn't have them defined yet. Does that answer that question, Sandrine?
I think it goes in the direction. I think that everyone is really wanting to have more clarity. And I think the answer to that is we're still in the process of really unpacking this. I don't know if there are others, but I think that what many are saying also in their questions is the need for clarity and also a better understanding of the reporting requirements for companies linked to this. I don't know if someone wants to answer in particular with regard to the kind of reporting element of this. You know, does it mean that all corporates would have to report on all do no significant harm criteria and thresholds, regardless of whether they contribute to an objective?
I think I'm going to say something very brief, and then I think that Paolo, who with his background, you know, previously of being a very senior person at Banca d'Italia, might add something on risk, because I think that's very strongly linked. So what I would say is, at the moment, the requirements for companies in the Article 8 Delegated Act do not require companies to report do no significant harm performance unless they're reporting an activity which is substantially contributing. So there was a proposal in the draft that was subject to public consultation that companies would report the do no significant harm in all cases of an activity that's in the taxonomy, but that was not taken forward. So at the moment, companies do not. But as I said, what we're discovering by talking to players in the market and to different entities is that many people are using those do no significant harm criteria to engage in their individual due diligence and discussions with companies. In terms of what we're thinking of as reporting, we have not got to that point. That is an important thing for us to think about. But we're aware that some people are using it, which is why we think there needs to be an assessment. And I don't know, Paolo, I don't know whether you could add on reporting, because of course there's a lot of other things going on, like TCFD and other corporate responsibility reporting.
And that is also key. People are asking about the linkages and are we not creating an extra burden, etc.
Well, I must say that as far as this SG3 work is concerned, we haven't got to such an advanced stage. So we don't have a direct answer to this question. On the other hand, it also depends on what is the option through which the Commission will decide to implement the recommendations that are interim recommendations so far, but they will become final recommendation in the future. So it also depends on whether option 1 or option 2, that are 2 options considered in the document, will be accepted. I remember that option 1 is a way to implement the recommendation without going through a reopening of the L1 of the regulation, and the second that is mainly through a guidance which should provide guidelines on how the SH or the NSI taxonomy should be used, both by the companies that have to disclose their activities, both and by financial operators, financial agents, banks, and so on. But also a guidance regarding the way in which the market should accept, should receive, or should perceive such disclosure in order to set up financial arrangements that are appropriate for supporting the transition of or the disposal of harmful activities. So, I mean, there are lots of intermediate steps that have to be, that we have to go through, and both the interaction with the Commission and the results of this public consultation will be very, very useful.
Great. Thank you, Paolo. I don't know if Kirsten, you want to add something. I think that, again, there are many other questions, and please, if any of you see some of the questions that I haven't answered, there's some that are also much more specific in terms of key sectoral activities. So, for example, the continuous question around fossil energy and also transportation of fossil fuels. Is any of this actually going to play a role in terms of the transition? Does actually fossil energy or fossil fuels that are not solid ever fall out of the red circles? So the fact that it actually does significant harm. Those are some of the questions, and how are we accepting and assessing actually companies with it or economic activities in that respect. Linked to that maybe is that there is a specific mention in our report around the significant harm extension, and that this may risk negatively impacting the ability of high carbon intensity sectors and companies carrying out harmful activities to raise finance for the transition. Is there anyone that would like to reflect on this?
I might have a quick go at some of the reporting pieces together, please. Sandrine, if that's all right. So adding to Paolo's response, it is possible to use significant harm criteria as a risk screen, but they are an environmental performance risk screen. They may or may not be a direct financial risk screen. So we need to understand the distinction. TCFD is focusing on financial implications of specific assumptions. And the taxonomy unashamedly and intentionally provides environmental performance criteria. So you could use those as part of a decision about the risk of a certain asset. You could say, wow, this asset's got huge emissions way above the significant harm curve. I might not see the pricing signal today or the demand change, but I think it's going to come. So you could do that if you wanted to. But let's just remember it's an environmental performance metric first and foremost to support decision-making. There's some really interesting questions around what happens if you create these criteria. Is there an obligation to report significant harm? Whereas in the past, you could have just not said anything because you weren't green. And this is an interesting question. It's a choice to be made about how this is used. It is possible, for example, just to recognize the transitions, just to recognize the capital expenditure, for example, that moves something from red to amber. That would be a legitimate reporting opportunity. Then the question becomes, well, how do you include that in the green asset ratio, or is it a separate reporting metric? They're important questions to answer. But sort of stepping up a level, maybe you just recognize the transitions. Or do you recognize the activity performance and require the activity performance reporting as well? So these are questions to be answered, recommendations to be made. So we, again, appreciate the feedback that you give on this. And I think this is some of the trade-offs here. The big plus is the clarity that you get. And for lots of companies and lots of investors, the clarity is really valuable. The potential downside, depending on how you look at it, is the reporting obligation that goes along with it. And of course, to have the clarity and make it comparable, you need the data. So you need the disclosures. In addition, there's a great question about the activities that we call, as Carsten said, no significant impact. And the question is, does that mean these activities could be considered part of a sustainable portfolio or a sustainable economy? Yes, the answer is yes, they could be. Assuming they're taking basic measures to improve, they certainly could be. But then again, you're creating this obligation to track and report and all of these additional elements of the framework. So these are some of the broader questions we're trying to trade off here, and we will do in our final recommendations. But where you see benefit, where you think you would use these additional criteria, then that's what we need to hear from you. We're pretty comfortable. We understand that it will create an extra reporting burden, but if you want to raise those points, by all means do that. The nuance, of course, is whether they're obligatory, required, or whether they become optional, and what type of disclosure requirement you build in. So your reflections on those are welcome. I've just tried to share a bit of context around them.
Thank you, Nathan. I think Nancy wants to come in here also because Yip has started quite a conversation in the chat around making sure that we have a strong system, but that also is usable and simple and clear. So Nancy, do you want to come in?
Yes, I do. I'm trying to just send the slides so that someone can put them. Yes, I do. I think that it's really important to emphasize two things. One is that we haven't fully thought through all the reporting and so on, and that we do need to think about how that works, but particularly for these intermediate transitions. But I wanted to highlight something I've put in the chat. First of all, we've put two examples of intermediate transition in the report, including tackling fossil fuel. So we've been, this is the platform's report. This is not the Commission's report. We've decided to get out there and talk about actually how some activities which are high impact at the moment, how they could use this as an example of a potential intermediate transition. So we've given a gas fired electricity example and a steel manufacturing example, and we do believe that that's helpful. I just wanted to touch on one point that was made by one of the people in the chat about keeping it simple. Just leave the green and the brown and then the middle space, which has not much impact. And I wanted to, it's not something we said, but it is something that we probably should have said. That the intermediate, the middle space, is not no significant impact. It is not. Those are, in general, impactful industries or sectors like transport, like power generation, like steel, like aluminium. And the middle space is still impactful. It is, for example, in power generation, between 100 grams and 270 grams of carbon dioxide per kilowatt hour.
So Nancy, I'm going to interrupt you.
What we're trying to just say, though, is that the no significant impact, which is the stuff that Carsten was talking about, is not the middle space of these industries and sectors that are in, but stuff that's not in there yet, but has such low impact. Let's give an example. It could be a financial advisors or maybe creches or those kind of activities, which even if you were to work through every NACE code, wouldn't be in the taxonomy for years and years and years. And so we're asking, well, is there a value in separating them out? There's absolutely not the same as the middle space of the activities that are in the traffic lights.
Okay, so within the middle space, there's many questions, obviously, again, that are coming back to the use of gas. Will gas ever be within part of that middle space or a green taxonomy? Can you answer that question? Because there still continues to be confusion. And Nathan also had an answer to the fossil sides, but where, if ever, do we see them coming in through the transitioning?
Well, I think, okay, so where you specifically mean the no significant impact activities then, Sandrine, or the other activities that are just not in the taxonomy yet? Sorry, because I'm trying to pick up which.
I think we need distinction there. So I'm leaving
Okay.
it to you to give further distinction to everyone so they
right,
have
so,
more clarity on those tricky areas.
I think activities that are coming but are not in the taxonomy yet, I do think, and I'm speaking completely without authorization from the chair, that it could be useful to people to know what is the platform going to work on next. I do think that could be useful so that they know, okay, here's, for example, let's say when they see the public consultation on the criteria that we will be coming out with, that maybe at some point it would be useful to say, look, next year in 2022, these are the sectors that the platform's going to be working on that will be coming into the taxonomy with criteria set. And of course, it's also important to remember that any sector can bring a request to the platform for that sector to be looked at and for the platform to consider how it might set criteria for that sector. And that's another thing which obviously we were setting up in the platform to allow for that kind of interaction with, for example, sector entities for a particular industry or something like that. That still leaves us with everything else that's left, the stuff that hasn't made it onto the list of things to do. And this is where we're really saying we do believe that there's a benefit in defining these low impact activities, these no significant impact activities, in order to distinguish them, in order to say, you know, these are largely service sectors with little direct impact. We have to think about ones with big indirect impact. I mean, for example, like travel agents or something like that. But we do believe there's value in doing that. What we're not clear, and we want to discuss through the public consultation, is whether that really needs a level 1 legislation change, or is it something, as Carsten said, that could be done through guidance, or is it a mixture of the two? But what we're really trying to do is indeed give clarity to what is not yet covered. And I do think that you don't get that clarity without some complexity, but we're trying to see how could we do that with the least complexity possible, especially taking account, as Carsten mentioned, that the great majority of entities, companies in those service sectors are very small, under 10 people.
Is there anyone else that wants to add something to this? I mean, what I'm seeing in a lot of the questions is, again, the need to better understand the differentiators between do no significant harm, do no significant impact, the middle space, etc., the transitioning, what will and will not be included. And I think that, Nancy, this just shows that we do have to continue to get better at explaining all of this. There also is a question that's more in the chat, which is quite interesting, which gets much more into the legality of all of this. For example, Ian asks, Article 9 funds must invest exclusively in sustainable investments. That seriously limits flexibility and pragmatism. Better to focus on a hybrid Article 8. You know, what are we looking at in terms of the legal aspects of this as well? And of course, the links with the delegated acts, etc. Is there someone who wants to add to this? Because clearly there will need to be some shifts.
I would say perhaps Nathan. Yeah.
Yeah, I can do this unless Carsten wants to come in. So you don't have to be 100% green in an Article 9 product, just to be clear. You have to apply the disclosure approach across the whole investment or finance portfolio. So just to distinguish Ian's comment there a little. Sorry, Sandrine, what was the second part of your question?
Well, it was more than they were indicating that it's better to focus on a hybrid Article 8+ approach in the IFID amendments.
Well, the point is people have got more flexibility than they perhaps realize. Remember, this is a transparency regime. It's not a mandatory investment framework. So, I mean, I actually see Article 8 and 9 as being on a bit of a continuum. They're not distinctly different. And just to everyone who's thinking about this, they're not labeling categories either. Just an early warning, that's not how they were set up. And that's not going to be a very useful way to try and categorize your financial product in the market. But putting that aside for one moment, the most important thing is to be clear on what the investment strategy of the product is, and to be clear on what the expected contribution arising from that strategy is to sustainability goals, and then to use the taxonomy to make that transparent to people. That's really how the framework is meant to work. If you want to work on the same process but the other way around and say, well, I want to start with the taxonomy and find all the places I can invest, fantastic, go for it. Absolutely, it should provide insights about where capital can flow and can substantially contribute. But the essential idea of having a hybrid approach, frankly, almost all of our products are going to be hybrid in some way. The idea of there being 100% green, dedicated, focused products, we know that's only ever going to be one component of a very broad financial universe. So we should not necessarily assume that everything must be green. This is why NSI's no significant impact is quite an interesting idea, because it signals to much of the economy that it's not necessarily ever going to be considered in that green category. And that's really an important signal for the market. The question is, how do we provide that signal and provide the right message to those companies and to investors in those sectors? So yes, but I can see there's some very interesting and difficult questions here around reporting obligations, I think, that we're going to have to take away. What reporting obligation do you trigger if you've got a significant harm threshold applied as such? And also, for example, one of the questions, Sandrine, around if I substantially contribute to one objective, but I fail to do no significant harm threshold in another area, have I suddenly got a significant harm asset? And that becomes the focus of what I'm doing. And so these fine-tuning issues are things that we're going to have to work through. But thank you, everyone, for raising the hard questions.
I very much agree.
Can I add on that one? Sorry, could I just say something?
Yes, just wait 1 second, Nancy. Absolutely. And maybe also, I think Nathan partially answered why no significant harm or no significant impact, is necessary. It would be good for you to build on that as well, because I agree, it's this refinement that's so important. And also partly let's recognize that a lot of what we're doing now is a reflection of the responses that we received with regard to the last taxonomy, to try to unpack some of the tensions, to try to better understand how we can give better signals to the market. But please, Nancy, go ahead.
So I think it's important to understand something about no significant impact. So I mentioned it's not the same as the amber space in the middle of the taxonomy activities. The issue is that the actual environmental impacts of those activities, even in aggregate, may be way, way less than even some of the green performance of these very impactful industries. So, for example, let's take one of the heavy industries, which the approach has been taken that the top 10% might be green. Well, those are still impactful industries, and yet what we're seeing is they might be as green somehow being prioritized over many, many thousands of very small companies doing what are basically very low impact, or providing services, sort of hairdressers or creches or financial advisors or lawyers, or all sorts of things like that. And so we're trying to say, well, how can we make sure they're not disadvantaged? How can we make sure, as we're trying to drive more money towards green, we don't disadvantage this incredibly important part of the economy, especially when that very small businesses have obviously been some of the most hard hit by the COVID pandemic. So on the other hand, how do you do that without overcomplicating the reporting? This is exactly what we're trying to weigh up. And indeed, in order that funds can say, look, we have this stuff which is not green, but look, a large chunk of it is perhaps this low impact type activities. On the flip side of that, you see the two question marks in the boxes. Well, one is that you could have activities that are green activities, even in the service sector. And we have to think, well, how can an entity that's really making itself a green entity, like, for example, let's think of a financial services advisor who's only advising on, green finance, on sustainable finance, or perhaps, you don't know, I don't know, a travel agent who's actually only providing assistance for ecotourism, travel by rail, and sort of environmentally friendly holidays. So the other question mark, the red question mark, is that these very small businesses, even when they have low impact on the environment, actually might be the most vulnerable to climate change impacts, because they're the smallest businesses, are sometimes least able to deal with those kind of shocks and issues, risks. So how do we support adaptation there, again, without overloading the system? So that's the kind of question we're talking about. And we're really still grappling with these questions and trying to think about different ways of doing it. On the, do you have to report significant harm? I mean, the answer is, if you are doing something which is a substantial contribution and you are not achieving the do no significant harm, then yes, you're doing significant harm. Now, the only one that makes an exception is adaptation, where basically if you're doing significant harm to that objective, you're probably doing significant harm to yourself. Whereas if you're doing significant harm under biodiversity mitigation, circular, etc., you're actually doing significant harm to the environment. And so we are looking at whether adaptation needs to be handled a little differently. But yes, and that actually is still required in the corporate reporting in Article 8. When you are not required to report any significant harm is, one, if you're in box 1. So if you're doing coal mining or peat-powered electricity generation or anything else that might be identified as these, you know, always significantly harmful activity, there's no requirement anywhere to report that. Your investors might ask you, but there's no requirement. And similarly, at the moment, unless you're claiming unless you're in an activity that's included, you don't have to say that you're failing. You don't have to report that you're failing do no significant harm. That has not been required. So let's say you were doing, I don't know, I'm trying to think something. Let's say you were doing steel manufacture, but you're not in the top 10, so you're not reaching substantial contribution. You do not then have to report whether you are passing or failing do no significant harm to biodiversity, to water, and so on. So at the moment, there is no reporting requirement, let's be clear. But what we're understanding is that these questions are nevertheless being asked by investors.
Sorry. Couple of questions with regard to the reporting requirements, and I'm going to bring Nathan back in to conclude and see if there are any other final comments from Paolo, Karsten, or Nancy. Some of you have asked that this discussion and the complexity makes it even more important to have transparency with regard to the methodology and the scientific references and how we are defining thresholds. Absolutely right. These webinars are part of that process. I don't think any of us would deny the need to make this very transparent. And let's not forget that that means we need to be basing our decision-making on science-based decision-making. So that would be the first reaction from me. Nathan, I'm sure that you want to add to that as well. The other key question that's also come up is that often corporate strategies are not public, and therefore it's not always easy to really see the direction in which they are going. And how do we shift this? This is not necessarily just to us, but it does make it more complex in terms of really understanding if corporations are truly going to transition or not in certain economic activities. And I think that also brings up another very key point that has been brought forward as well, which is that how do we really truly assess transition activities? And also, as we're moving through this consultation process, some are asking, what's next? What do you need from us? How can we both best engage? Can someone, maybe Nathan, you give a little bit of an idea of the process update, where we are, etc., so that everyone knows in all transparency where they can best engage and move forward. Last key point that seems to be coming up as well, the taxonomy was never meant to be the only tool in the toolbox. We all recognize that. Some of you have asked around, are we really going to meet Fit for 55 with the taxonomy? I would very much hazard a guess to say no. But if the taxonomy is properly crafted alongside other sustainable finance tools, then it could facilitate the shift to meet Fit for 55. But we clearly need to have the policy direction. And Nathan, I would love to have your remarks on that. The investment community is not just looking at the taxonomy. It's looking at the overarching policy direction and clear policy signals that are coming from the European Commission and elsewhere as well. So Nathan.
Thank you, Sandrine. Would you like this to be my closing comment as well?
I think so, because we have 5 minutes, and I don't know if Nancy wants to then come in or if Nancy wants to go first. I don't know what is the best way forward, but I'm leaving it up.
Nathan, why don't you go and then just give me a minute at the end? I'd say a couple of things.
All right, great. Thank you, everyone. Okay, so I'll start with the consultation, and thanks for the comments on the timeline. We have released the consultation links. You can go and click through and see the questions. Just so you know, they are specific questions, most of them closed-ended. I can't remember the exact number, maybe 12, 14, forgive me, but so this is not an extensive open-ended consultation. We've tried to be quite precise. And so we hope that you will be able to answer, even though we've only allowed just under 7 weeks for the consultation. The other thing to note is we must simply work on the Commission's regulated timeline here. And there must be a Commission report by the end of the year, so there must be some time to consider our consultation and the feedback and our final recommendations around October to the Commission. Doesn't leave the Commission a lot of time. Of course, the irony of this is that we've just spent 6 months arguing about the first delegated act, which has built so much time into this process for everybody involved. And maybe on a moment reflection, I think, if we'd have had this tool 6 months ago, maybe we would have had a slightly different argument on some of the criteria in the delegated act, because there would have been a deeper and wider understanding and way to recognize activities. So please forgive us, but just see this in the whole. The Commission's regulated timeline is what really drives us. And we've tried to come up with a consultation tool which you can answer quite quickly. So log in early, please look at the questions. The second thing on methodology and criteria setting is quite important. To this end, our technical working group will be publishing criteria that deal with the additional 4 environmental objectives right at the end of July. Now, before you groan on timing, which I could understand, the consultation for that piece of work goes until around the 17th, I think 18th of September. So we've tried to stagger them a little to provide some ease, but there will be a lot of methodology discussion in that paper. And we'll set out how we set criteria, how we judge ambition levels, and hopefully that will help answer this question on methodology more clearly. And we're also contemplating how to restate in a consistent way methodologies that were used on climate mitigation and adaptation. So thank you for those points. Now, on taxonomy, I'll make this my last point. It's true that taxonomy is not the only tool. Investors and banks and other financiers still try and make financial returns. We should not assume that the financial market doesn't do this anymore. Taxonomy is one tool in the toolbox, albeit we think an increasingly important one, because not all of the objectives and the externalities are properly priced, of course. While we work towards that, we need tools that tell us about ultimate environmental objectives and our performance on those. This is going to be part of the way we work on multiple sustainability challenges because they're moving faster than our ability to price them. And so this is why taxonomy has a role. It's not the only tool, but it is an essential tool. Help us, please, to design the best form of it that we can. We're open to everything you share and are listening, and we'll do our best to make sound, market-informed, environment and socially science and institutionally informed recommendations for the Commission to finalise their report. Thanks, Sandrine.
Thanks so much, Nathan. Nancy?
Yes, so just on this point of the taxonomy being only one tool in the toolbox, absolutely, and we've put some things in our report about that. Indeed, in terms of the question about reporting negative impact, you have the principal adverse impact indicators and SFDR. We have the NFRD being transformed into the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive. We also have, you know, the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, and we see a number of European member states starting to request or insist on compulsory risk reporting for climate, and we now have the nature approach for disclosures also being developed. So I think there's a lot happening, and indeed, as Nathan said, the risk is that not everybody understands how fast this is moving, not only how fast it has to move, but how fast the financial system is moving. And I come back to something I said at the very beginning, which is whether it's reported or not, whether we write it down and design it and define it or not, the risks are there, the risks stay there. And in fact, it may be the very people who are not aware and who are not looking at this, where the risks start to multiply and where finance is actually at risk and jobs are at risk. And ultimately, sustainable finance, like Paris alignment, is about doing a lot more and driving finance towards the things that really help, but also in a managed way, stopping doing the things or transforming the things that are causing the problem. And so we have to balance that up with usability. But indeed, I think this is a moment when the whole financial system is starting to shift. And we're just trying to make sure that we put in place the part of the puzzle that helps with that discussion.
Thank you, Nancy. I'm going to close with a real doozy of a question, but I'm going to do it very quickly, and I hope one of you can respond, because this is something that keeps on coming up, which is, does this create a problem for us with regard to our competitiveness vis-a-vis the rest of the world? Does this demonstrate leadership, or does it actually create a problem in terms of transparency for EU companies? Does anyone have a quick fired answer on this? But I do think that it's really important that we realize, and Nathan and I were just actually in a call with Australia, believe it or not, where there is some interest actually in the taxonomy. We know that China and other parts of the world are putting in place similar taxonomies, including the UK. So Nathan, just a quick fire response, because I think it's really important to motivate people around this.
Sandrine, forgive me. Carsten, go ahead.
I can say a few words. Nancy already mentioned it. The risks are there, and the opportunities are there, and those will be evaluated with or without transparency. I think transparency can add a big value, even on a global scale. And there's other markets that will follow suit, maybe somewhat differently and with some nuances, but certainly investors across the globe, that's at least what I see and I would expect to come, is that there will be a global approach by investors step by little step, and likely sooner than later.
Thank you so much, Carsten. Nathan, did you want one last word?
Yeah, very quickly. I think we need to recognize that even the best intentions of our governments are going to struggle to deal with all of these environmental and social transition challenges at the same time and in a comprehensive way. We in markets need to start to have a good understanding of the fundamentals of the issues, of the environmental and social performance levels that are required to support our activities in the economy. This is what the taxonomy can do. We count over 20 taxonomies in the world. The harmonization discussion is well underway. But the most important thing is that we add this tool of environmental and social performance. This is, in my view, a lasting reform, and the information is essential to our good decision-making. So thank you and well done for your contribution and participating today, and we'll keep our dialogue going with you.
Wonderful. Thank you all. Really fabulous questions, all incredibly useful. We will keep them with us as we continue to unpack the work that we're doing, and we look forward to getting some of your answers to the questions in the consultation. There will continue to be a series of webinars, and please be safe, take care of yourselves, and see you soon.